Hello and welcome to Decision Makers, the podcast that takes you inside the boardroom where all the big decisions in the world of football are made. I am Hugh Woozencroft, once again alongside me former Premier League defender Curtis Davies and Managing Director of Unique Sports Group Marlon. Fleischmann, gentlemen, welcome back once again.
Thank you.
Today's episode, very, very important indeed. It's about the thing that dominates the conversation right now when it comes to football, at least off the pitch, and that is money, and more money. Yes, we are talking football finances today, and I'm delighted to say we have the guest to help us discuss it. That is Kieran Maguire, a lecturer in football finance from the University of Liverpool Management School. Kieran, welcome to Decision Makers. How are you?
I'm very good. Thank you very much. I'm a Brighton fan, so I'm living the dream at present when it comes to football. I'm actually had to think about things on the pitch for a change, which is most enjoyable.
Of course, Kieran, by the way, is the author of Price of Football and a co-host of the Price of Football podcast. Absolutely brilliant as well. So delighted to have his wealth of experience with us today. And I'm going to dive straight in by asking you where you sit on football finance at the moment. What is the state of money in the game right now?
Football is very good at generating money. If we take a look at the history of the Premier League, for example, since it started, prices for consumers in general have doubled, but the revenue coming into the Premier League has increased by 3,000%. So that's an incredible achievement. Where football is a problem is in terms of cost control. So whilst the money's come into the game has increased by 3,000%, wages have increased by 3,800 and transfer fees have increased by over 4,000. So to paraphrase Sir Alan Sugar, what comes in is going out even faster. And that's created the environment in which we have at present, where 19 out of 20 clubs in the Premier League are losing money on a day-to-day basis. And when you take a look at the Championship, it's just as bad. And the lower leagues are a wee bit better, but not greatly so.
Why aren't clubs keeping the money in the game? This is going to be an easy one, Curtis. They want a new centre-back. They've seen Curtis Davies on film and they say, we got to go and get him. No cost bar, all cost barred basically, right? They will spend whatever it takes to get the best team possible on the pitch. And also, it's very competitive. So we can almost understand why transfer fees are being spent. But wages, surely it's cut your cloth accordingly.
It's interesting to say cut your cloth accordingly because, for instance, if you then go and you're willing to go and spend, let's say, 70 million on a player and you try and offer them a contract that, in their eyes, for a 70 million pound player that might be record signing for this club, marquee signing, and you try and offer them an average wage amongst that squad, they're not going to sign it. So ultimately, with the transfer fee, and that's not to say the player that maybe signs for 10 million hasn't got a value to say, well, hang on, no, I should be up the top of the earners. But when the transfer fee comes, regardless of your thoughts on the player and where they should be earning, the fact you're willing to spend 70 million, you're not going to let the wage be the thing that gets in the way of getting the player. So I think that's just a symptom of the transfer fee.
It's a symptom of international football, isn't it? All over the globe, people are spending money that they probably don't have, and yet there seems to be some kind of ecosystem that means the wheels keep turning. How does this happen?
It's the DNA of the sport, isn't it? You want to be competitive and you want your team to be winning. And to do that, you're going to invest in the best possible players and try and bring those players to your club. And that then brings you into having to pay salaries that maybe you don't want to pay or bring in additional players. And you end up, as Kieran said earlier, suddenly that money that you bring into the club evaporates very quickly. You've mentioned it's a global game, and it is, because it's the same all around the world. The desire to win leagues and win trophies isn't just a Premier League thing. It's all around the world. Everyone wants to go and win their league and qualify for their European tournament or global tournament. It's all about winning.
Kieran, can you put your finger on something in particular as to why clubs don't make more money? Can't be as simple as we just want to win trophies, because as we know, there are only a handful of clubs that can realistically, for example, win the Premier League. So why are the clubs in the middle of the Premier League spending so much money, or even at the bottom of the Premier League and the Championship you mentioned, spending so much money?
I think it's partly due to the huge gaps we have in football. If you get relegated from the Premier League, the TV money that you will get will go from around about 105, 110 million pounds to 8 million pounds in the Championship. So you don't want to do that. So therefore, if the manager comes to the chief executive and the owner in January and says, I spotted this lad, he's a little bit out of our budget, but I think that can make the difference between getting relegated and not getting relegated, and puts forward a persuasive case, then the owners will quite often say, we want to be in the Premier League. Everybody wants to be at the top tier. And it is a limited talent pool. It is a competitive market. Talent follows the money, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And what we also have is the rise of, and we don't tend to see this in American sport, we have the rise of the trophy asset owner, for whom making money from football is not a critical point. So therefore, we saw, for example, when Roman Abramovich came into the Premier League in 2003, he set a new benchmark in terms of wages, which meant that if the likes of Manchester United and Arsenal and Liverpool wanted to be competitive, they had to be more generous in what they offered players. And then exactly the same thing happened when Sheikh Mansour acquired Manchester City. And therefore, that's effectively increased the benchmark for wages at the elite end. Even amongst what you might refer to as the middle classes of the Premier League, they still want to get into the Europa League, because that itself can be worth an extra 30 to 40 million pounds. And the owners want success. They want to be liked. Newcastle United under Mike Ashley was a sustainable football club, and he was loathed in the Northeast as a result of that. Spurs are the most profitable club in the history of the Premier League, but fans don't celebrate that. Fans want to win, and that desire to be successful, even if it's winning cups or even just getting into the top 4 or the top 6, is so seductive that owners end up subsidising clubs at the levels that we see today.
Another trophy for the Tottenham trophy cabinet there. The most profitable club in the history of the Premier League. I'm sure they'll be delighted to find out. Sustainability. Is that a word that we should link to football, particularly in England? Is it an impossible dream to feel that football clubs could remain sustainable?
I think if we look at the most recent summer transfer window, I think we talk about sustainability. The days of clubs just spending vast amounts of money on a 27, 28, 29-year-old, they're going. I think what we've seen is a massive sway towards signing younger, asset rich players that twofold. Either you can bring in a 19, 20, 21-year-old, and Kieran, you'll probably know better than me on this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the amount of money spent on players under the age of 22 this year was a record, and probably more than at any other stage in the transfer window. And this is the strategy of clubs now, is to say, okay, look, if I go and sign a 21-year-old, 22-year-old or younger, they either become an absolute hit in my first team, so I then don't have to spend money again for the next 3, 4, 5 years because this player will grow with us. Or the flip side is, I bring them in, I bed them, I play them, then suddenly they become a huge value to sell on, and that keeps me sustainable with my headroom.
I think the sustainability tag is interesting because a lot of the clubs are sustaining what they're doing year in, year out, having losses. So I think sustainability is, yes, clubs can afford to lose a certain amount each year, but actually, be it chairman and board people are still taking a dividend from that. So actually, they're getting paid their money. But at the same time, the club's growth in terms of, because the Premier League and because of the TV rights always getting bigger and bigger, the club will grow in value. So if I just use Manchester United as an example, which is the glaring one, obviously the Glazers leveraged the club to then put the debt back on the club, serviced themselves with dividends and payments every year, and then sold the club for a record fee. So it's, whilst the club's losing money or breaking even or whatever you want to say it, ultimately, because the value of the club each year, the Premier League money goes up, will be going up and up. And there's always, especially now, there's only 20 teams in the Premier League, and everyone's fighting out. All these foreign investors are now fighting out to get that team. It's a high market. So, if you hold on to a team for even 4 or 5 years, because that new TV deal is going to be in again, you could probably flip the club for an extra 50% on what you paid on it.
We'll come to TV deals a little bit later on, but you spoke about investment there of owners and the amount of money being lost. And the glaring one, I think, in recent times has been Chelsea, who have spent more money than any other football club probably in the last 2.5 years. Has that put a shock into the system, do you think, Kieran, in terms of where football is heading with spending now? Are they the great disruptors? I mean, basically, you'd have to answer the question that no one else can answer at this point in time, which is what on earth are Chelsea doing?
I think the Saudi Pro League was a big disruptor 2 or 3 years ago. The Chelsea model is intriguing, signing players on long contracts and effectively locking them in at what Chelsea are claiming are relatively low wages. We will look back in 3 or 4 years' time and either say it was a work of complete genius, or they'd entered a market which they didn't understand, and they've got their fingers burnt as a result. So I think the Chelsea model is intriguing. Certainly the level of money that's being spent is unprecedented. But what Chelsea don't get credit for is their ability to trade players as far as the exit door is concerned. If you take a look at player sales since, for example, since Sir Alex Ferguson retired in 2013, Chelsea have generated twice as much money from player sales as Liverpool and Manchester City, and 4 or 5 times as much as Manchester United. So Chelsea have actually got an additional indoor when it comes to money. Chelsea make more money from player sales sort of over a 5 to 10 year period than they do from ticket sales, because they are very, very good at utilising that model. And I think that's what they're going to try to do. And as you were saying a little bit earlier, it's now a case of getting the players at an earlier age than before, utilising them either as first team, first choices, in which case you give them enhanced contracts, as we've seen with Cole Palmer, or they do okay and they're attracted to other clubs and they can still be sold at a profit. So the game is sustainable as long as owners continue to want to buy in. And I can assure you, if you saw my email inbox, there is no shortage of potential owners of football clubs, all from overseas, it has to be said. But the United States market and the Middle Eastern market in terms of interest in English football has never been as buoyant as it is at present.
Kieran, and I've kind of come up with this strategy of how they can all take over the clubs, and I just wondered if you think it would be viable. If there were to be an incident where you get, let's say Newcastle, they're owned by a Saudi group, let's say, and you get a Man City that's owned by UAE-backed investors, and they have the cash. They actually have the cash to invest in the club, but they're hamstrung by, obviously, certain things, PSR, and they can't put as much money in as they want. Do you think there's scope to then say, right, the Premier League handle an account of that team? Let's say it is Newcastle. Newcastle put 500 million on deposit with the Premier League. Anything we lose above the PSR rating, they can pay that debt out of that 500 million. Therefore, you protect the clubs from actually going bankrupt like a Portsmouth, because that's kind of the main example of why the rules were brought in. But also, you probably actually can improve the product of the Premier League, because you're going to end up buying Galacticos. If you've got a blank check, as long as you've got the money, it will be, obviously, don't get me wrong, it'd be the Wild West for a little while. But do you think it's something that could work, could be sustainable? It
certainly can, Curtis. So the use of a bond, in effect, in the similar way to we have in some other industries, whereby if you're going to commit to spend money above a particular level, then the owner has to give a demonstration of good faith by putting that money aside. So even if Newcastle or Manchester City, or it doesn't matter, whoever the club is losing money on a week-by-week basis, because the owner has put money aside to cover the wages for the next 2 or 3 years, then there's no reason why you can't have a more competitive Premier League or Championship. You see the frustration from some owners. You've only got to talk to people who are associated with Stoke City, for example. Yeah, they're owned by a very successful organisation. That organisation has limitless amounts of money, but they are hamstrung in terms of the desire to get Stoke City back into the Premier League by the PSR rules. And then I think you've got to have a serious debate within football itself, because it then becomes a sort of my dad's richer than your dad environment, in which the richest clubs can afford to buy the best players. But to a certain extent, that's always been the case in football. Manchester United under Sir Alex Ferguson was spectacularly successful, and there's no doubt that his genius was a major contributory factor. But Manchester United's ability, certainly during the first 10 to 12 years of the Premier League, when they were the wealthiest club there, played a big part in their ability to both recruit and retain players. So having a bond, or perhaps having some form of luxury tax saying for every pound that you spend on transfers and wages above a particular agreed level, you've got to pay £5 in tax, and that goes back into the Premier League pot, and potentially some of that goes to grassroots as well, could be beneficial. If you want to spend that level of money, then fine, but if you're paying a 500% tax, then it does become an expensive, very expensive hobby, but there's people that are willing to spend it.
Obviously you said about the rich clubs having the best pick of players, of course, but with that scope and with the interest in overseas ownership, do you not think it would be, someone thinks, I don't actually need to get Manchester United or Man City because I don't need a structure. I'll go and buy Brentford. And I'll buy Mbappe, I'll buy Neymar, I'll buy Messi, and we'll turn Brentford into Galacticos. Do you not think that it would just bring the interest in terms of for all clubs, because there's always going to be somebody that wants to buy them?
Yes, we've only got to go back again to the start of the Premier League era, and Jack Walker effectively did that with Blackburn Rovers. Blackburn went from being a sleepy, traditional, historic football club in the second tier of English football to winning the Premier League and getting into Europe, and that was on the back of the wealth of the owner. So if it was acceptable for that to take place 30 years ago, why can't it be acceptable for that to take place at Brentford or another small club such as Crystal Palace or wherever that might be?
I think we end up getting into the have and have-nots. The problem we end up with is always the majority vote at the Premier League meetings. These ideas that would bring additional profile, additional revenue to the league, they would be voted down by other clubs going, we couldn't put that 500 million in the bond. So therefore, if we can't do it, you're not doing it, we're all voting against it. And the league is almost at an impasse where you can't bring in these creative ideas.
It's interesting though, because a lot more of the ownership groups are now having the actual cash to do it. And again, like some are from, be it investment bonds and stuff like that, but I'd be really interested to see, if it were a club and they had an opportunity to put money in this bond that allows them to spend more money, whether they do another fundraiser throughout their all investors to then get it held and make the product better.
They had to spend it all in the first year.
Well, yeah, that's all.
Here's the thing. My concern with it is that even the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia can say, we've got this much money, fantastic. Doesn't mean they're actually prepared to spend it all on a football club. And that's the same for any owner of a football team, whether that be Bournemouth or Spurs or, it's great to say, well, listen, you're holding us back. Our owner's worth £5 billion. It's like, well, doesn't mean your owner wants to spend £5 billion on their football team. So I think there has to be some level of control. Does it hold the product back is what I think a lot of, let's say, senior figures in football, stakeholders in football would say around the Premier League. We know there's been loads of discussions around this recently, an independent regulator overhanging football, the possibility that any spending controls there will firstly hold clubs back from success. And a lot of teams think, well, Newcastle, for example, why can't we be at the top of the Premier League right now? We've got the money to buy the players to do that. But obviously secondary to that, an independent regulator may affect the quality of the Premier League if it stops our clubs signing the best players in the world. The thing for me right now is there doesn't seem to be an appetite from the other big leagues, at least in Europe, to transcend what the Premier League are doing in terms of finances. So there isn't really a need to push the finances further other than the clubs themselves want to do it? I don't know where you sit in all of this, Kieran. What's responsible versus, that might be the boring thing for football fans, versus what would be the exciting thing to do for football in England?
I think we already have the most exciting league in European football in many regards. Although, if you take a look at Serie A, there's been sort of four different champions in the last 5 or 6 years. So that in terms of competitive balance has been intriguing. The Premier League is spectacularly successful because 30 years ago, it was the first league to go to the international markets and to give its product away. And that's what it did. It said, we've just come out of the 80s, and I'm old enough to remember watching football in the 80s as a fan, that the stadiums were not in good condition. Attending matches was a more challenging issue than going to a match today. That's certainly the case. And there was this bright new product called the Premier League. It was given away to all of these international markets for nothing. And then 5 years later, when those contracts came up for renewal, the Premier League started charging. We've just seen the Premier League announce a 17% increase in broadcasting revenues over the course of the next 3 or 4 years. Well, in France, the value of their broadcasting rights has halved. In Germany, it's down by 10%. In La Liga and Italy, it's flatlining. So the Premier League is by far the biggest payroll league as far as European football is concerned. Yes, you've got a couple of clubs in individual countries that can match, but the fact that the likes of Bournemouth can outspend Internazionale or Napoli or clubs of that stature, I think is indicative of the success of the Premier League. So the money is already there. You then have the desire to avoid relegation, which is going to encourage clubs to spend more. The desire to get into Europe, which is going to encourage clubs to spend more, and the desire to win the Premier League, which is going to make clubs spend more. So everybody's got an incentive to spend more. And that's why we have this non-sustainable product in traditional terms. But if you're owned by a billionaire, and of the 20 Premier League clubs, I think we've got 19 billionaires or sovereign wealth funds within that. Why not spend it on subsidising a football club? If you enjoy it, the fans enjoy it, the manager enjoys it, I don't really see too much of a downside.
I'm sure if this independent regulator truly becomes concrete, you will soon become a government advisor. So what would you advise them to do in terms of putting any spending controls around the Premier League?
I would advise them not to interfere too much. Ideologically, I don't want a regulator. I think we need a regulator due to the lack of governance in the game and the fact that Super League and Project Big Picture and some of the more distasteful elements or proposals are still floating around the ether. And I think football needs protection from a fan's perspective to have the regulator. But in terms of getting involved in the day-to-day operations and setting the rules in terms of cost control, that should be delegated back to the club. I think the only financial issue that the regulator should get involved in is coming up with a deal which works for both the Premier League and the EFL. And the Premier League clubs have to be protected. The fact that we've got these global brands, the likes of Manchester United and Liverpool and Arsenal and City and so on, is absolutely fantastic. So we don't want to hold those clubs back. At the same time, I think the dealing with the step up and the step down between Premier League and Championship and League One and also League Two and National League does have to be addressed. And if the leagues can't sort it out amongst themselves, then reluctantly, I think the regulator will have to step in.
So clearly money coming into football, but clearly a need for some kind of structure around it, which may have a knock-on effect around the industry for all of us, even those of us in media. There are a number of people coming into the game feeling that they are going to make some money here for the first time in a long time. They used to say, if you want to lose money, the first thing you should do is buy a football club, basically. And although we're not seeing loads of these clubs making money, maybe there's a long-term game here. The TV deal is going up. We hear announcements. We'll talk about the specific TV deal in a little bit, but announcements that the Premier League are going to take their broadcast model in-house. That might mean that, for example, we get streaming apps now just for Premier League football. That might be something that's distributed all over the world. So it might be an increase in revenue in that regard. Again, if better players come, we may see more people watching the Premier League, bigger stadiums. You know, it sounds good. So I can understand why the likes of Todd Boehly and Clear Lake Capital and many other American investors have decided to come to the Premier League, Marlon. We've got a big Middle Eastern ownership group as well. We spoke about Newcastle, Manchester City, we know about already. And there could be much, much more. Do you feel like people are coming to the Premier League because actually they think, finally, it's going to be worth spending the money?
I don't think we've reached or got anywhere near the peak of the values of football clubs globally. For want of a better word, for the cost of the franchise or the value of the franchise. However, I think where we end ourselves now is a real difficult balancing act between understanding that the product of the Premier League needs to grow. It needs to keep on being competitive and entertaining to go and guarantee that next big TV deal, that next big competition or sponsorship deal or anything that can make that league and competition more valuable. However, if you impose more and more financial control, the trends, and if we look at what Kieran was saying before, the landscape of the European leagues and the competitor leagues, that has to ring alarm bells. If you're looking at what the trends have of spending control in La Liga or in France or in the German league has done to those divisions, that's the reason why they can't compete with the Premier League. We can't squeeze almost the life out of the Premier League to a point where the teams are hamstrung and can't invest and can't go and compete, because then that drags down the value of the overall product, which we need to remain strong for the Premier League to be the strongest league in the world.
I think my argument to that is they can lose £35 million a year, right? So was it £105 million over a 3-year accounting period? So, you know, when we talk about financial controls, what we're saying is you can lose money.
Because that was
quite a significant amount of money.
But that was the same value that it was in 2013. The cost of the cost of those, if you're allowed to lose that much money in 2013, you should be allowed to lose so much more now just on inflation alone.
Well, that was going to be my second point, actually. So actually the argument is not that we hamstrung clubs, if you like, hamstring clubs, if that's the right term, hold them back. In fact, it's that we make sure that they can spend enough money to keep us ahead of other European leagues, but we don't just go spend whatever you want, because that could put some clubs in jeopardy, even with very, very wealthy owners. So some control, some restraint, but not too much.
We end up in the world of finding this balance, but how do you put a one-size-fits-all approach to all of these competitive clubs? It's really difficult, really difficult.
That's the point to it. We want it to be a competitive league, but right now there's a top 6 effectively that we kind of look at and think they're going to be there pretty much there or thereabouts every year. So by then making the power that, yes, they can do this and do that, but still based around PSR rules and financial fair play or whatever you want to call it, that's because they'll be in the Champions League, they'll be in all these competitions earning the most money because they're at the top of the Premier League and stuff like that. So actually by saying you can spend what you want to Brentford or to Burnley or to whoever else want to come into the Premier League and say, well, you've got a shot at it if you want to do it. You might go back down next year, but you can have a go. It just makes for, in my opinion, it would make for a really interesting Premier League to see if, like I say, the so-called superpowers of this league, we found, obviously Leicester did it organically, the way they won the league, but we find teams, anomalies, that now have this financial backing that can go and win a Premier League. And I think Kieran alluded to it. Blackburn did it all those years ago. Why can't we see it again?
Kieran, I wanted to ask you about Middle Eastern influence in football and where, you mentioned the Saudi Pro League a little bit earlier on. So it's not just the ownership of individual clubs. Of course, we know that the World Cup will go to Saudi Arabia. Is it 2034 as well? What Saudi Arabian influence, what Middle Eastern influence could do for finances in football from here on out? What do you expect, Kieran?
Well, it could certainly prime the pump, and we saw that 2 or 3 windows ago when the Saudi Pro League really wanted to make a name for itself and it recruited all of those players. Forbes came out with a report a couple of weeks ago, which showed that 3 of the top 4 highest players in the world are currently in the Saudi Pro League. It's clear that you've got Neymar, Ronaldo, and Sadio Mane, and the 4th one was Lionel Messi, who's playing in the US. So it is indicative that you can have a disruptor. I think it's going to be a long-term issue as far as the Saudi Pro League is concerned. It's not going to be like the Chinese Super League, where we saw potential disruption in 2016, but that sort of reversed itself fairly quickly because Saudi Arabia wants to host the World Cup in 2034. I think the intriguing issue, and as a fan, it's something I wouldn't want to see, of course, is the Premier League is so popular. You can't get everybody to Anfield or to Old Trafford or to the Etihad or the Emirates, whoever that's going to be, on a week-by-week basis. Can we therefore have something similar to what we're seeing in the NFL, being funded by overseas investment in terms of taking the Premier League to other markets geographically? And that would cause huge uproar amongst fans. But we've seen that owners don't always listen or don't always think in the best interests of fans. And if that's going to be the case, who's going to have the biggest wallets in terms of willingness to host these matches between the top Premier League teams? It's going to be likely to be a Middle Eastern market.
I think Kieran's right, and I think the fans won't want to see Premier League games, official games being played in foreign territories, but I think it will start with cup finals and maybe a League Cup final or the Charity Shield being moved to a foreign host to almost test pilot. And if you look at Serie A, they've already done that. Mm. And there's been no fan backlash because it's almost seen as if you're playing a final away, both sets of fan groups have to travel anyway. If you're doing a European final, you're travelling to a European destination. So it's taking a final to be played over there, I don't see that being too far away.
I think the Charity Shield is one thing. In modern day, it's become less of a trophy and more of the friendly before the season starts for the big teams. So I think the Charity Shield, no problem, send that wherever you want in the world and we'll deal with it. I think when it comes to a big cup final, let's say, so for me, the FA Cup final is still massive. I'm brought up here, I grew up watching the FA Cup final every year, blah, blah, blah.
Wait, you don't want to mention the FA Cup final you played in?
No, I won't talk about that. That's on another episode.
Very modest.
But with that being said, if you are to then say, right, we're going to send it to Saudi Arabia or to LA, let's say, are you going to guarantee that any fan that does want to go, oh yeah, you'll still get your ticket? So all we're doing is we're moving it to LA, but then we're taking 30,000 Arsenal fans and 30,000 Hull fans, and then the rest is made up of a few Americans or Saudis. But that's not the point of the product. The point of the product is to take the game away and to then take it so that these foreign countries and foreign fans can now watch these clubs live in front of their face in a competitive game. But what will happen is there'll be fan backlash, because if for instance, you've been to every cup final since, if you're a City fan, you've been to every cup final since they've started getting to finals. Yeah. And all of a sudden, one's now in Saudi Arabia. I can afford the ticket and the train and everything to London, to Wembley. How am I going to get to Saudi Arabia? Flights have just gone up because everyone's flying out there. So I think there'll be too much of a fan backlash. And I think from that fan backlash, I think it will make clubs take the back foot on that kind of idea. I think
the clubs will preempt that. I think there'll be club planes or club travel, or there will be some. The clubs will sit there and will go, right, how is this going to upset people? Mm-hmm. It may need to happen to keep that investment into the league, but they're going to want to soften it with the fans. If they've learnt nothing after the reaction from the Super League, then they deserve all the backlash they get.
Yeah, and also the fans may do a deal with themselves philosophically if, for example, we are told you either lose the League Cup or the semi-finals and final end up in a new territory. What would you rather have? Oh, and by the way, the prize money is going to triple. Or, especially if you're a lower league team, you're going to be getting, instead of £100,000 for reaching round 4, you're going to get £500,000. Suddenly clubs say, well, we weren't going to make the final anyway, so maybe we can sign up to this. So that might be, I guess, an exchange of ideas for some people. But I don't know if it would happen. But again, I think it comes back down to the thing that we're discussing: finances and money in football. The other thing that it harks, though, to, for me, is the idea of the multi-club model in football. So suddenly, I don't want to use Chelsea again. Manchester United, for example, suddenly their pre-season tour sees them go to 5 or different, they already go abroad, but maybe they're going now to 5 or 6 different cities on different continents. And suddenly you're seeing a Manchester United play their pre-season games in new territories. And then suddenly it becomes, the first round of the third round of the FA Cup, certain teams are going to be playing abroad. And by the way, I know, Kidderminster Harriers, even though you've got the draw of your life away at Old Trafford, that game's actually going to be played in Singapore. Sorry, Kidderminster fans, but the good news is your team's going to get, £20 million for this one game. And so it could transform the football club. Again, philosophically changing things for people. And maybe the multi-club model is a way of moving your team around the world without it suggesting to your fans that you really want to do that. You just, it's our other team. We're just playing a friendly against our team in Montevideo. It isn't necessarily us taking Chelsea abroad. What do you think, Kieran, of the multi-club model and how specifically teams might use it? Because I think that's the big thing. Is it going to be, with all these teams with a multi-club model, do they want to have a league in every continent that's a franchise for just them and their ownership groups? What exactly are they trying to do with the multi-club model?
Well, we already have over 200 clubs as part of MCOs, mainly based in Europe, but they've also now got extensions to South America, to Asia in particular. It's a good way of shifting money around because you can move players to where it's most useful within the group to have profits for the equivalent of PSR. So there are benefits both financially but also structurally, because now you can have a single philosophy in terms of the style of play. You can have the adoption of sports science and physiotechnology across the group, which means that if you've got a promising player, you send him out to one of your satellite clubs and that player learns to play. Let's say, if we take the City Football Group, you learn to play the Manchester City way because that's how the City, New York City, and that's how Melbourne City, and that's how Mumbai City play football. So there are certainly strategic benefits of having such an approach, and there are financial benefits as well. As we are starting to see, we've now got the FIFA Club World Cup due to take place in 7 or 8 months' time, and we've got 2 Mexican clubs who are owned by the same owner who potentially could be in that competition, and that goes against FIFA's own rules. So it creates problems, but certainly from an owner's point of view, it reduces risk, it reduces costs, it can enhance revenues because you can go to sponsors and kit manufacturers and say, I can not just give you a fan base based in England, but if we have the same logo, if we have the same style of kit, you can have that in South America, you can have that in Australia, you're going to have that in Asia as well. And that becomes very seductive. So there's business, the business reasons for it are overwhelming. I think the footballing reasons are more cautious.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. You sounded very romantic when you said that the players can then go and learn the way of playing in a certain city mould. Say if they went to Mumbai City or Melbourne City. But really and truly, I think that group is slightly different, but other multi-club ownership groups, it's a case of, like I say, trading players at your leisure. So it's, for instance, I'm not going to say the clubs, but a club would loan a player and they'd be on loan for 3 years in a row. And then when it's time that club that's loaning out the player needs a cash injection, the other club will actually buy them, and it's basically passing one hand from your left hand to your right hand, money from your left hand to your right hand. And I think that's kind of just the way the model originally came around. I think City are doing it, in my opinion, in a good way in terms of the model of the coaching and the philosophy. I think that's working, but ultimately the level of Melbourne City, New York City, Mumbai City, to say that you're going to come to Manchester City is a totally different thing. But I just think that the model now is more to be able to, yes, these players are surplus. I'll loan them there, loan them there, loan them there. We're paying for all of them anyway. They'll go make our other clubs better, hopefully make the other products better. And then in the meantime, those players will get a value. But other than that, I think I don't think it goes much further than that.
Is this a massive negative for football agents, the multi-club model? I just can't see why, as a football club, I want to pay you twice.
No, I think it's we're very wary of keeping almost an independent career path for a player, and I think you go into a club that is within a multi-club system and think, okay, where is this player going to go? Is he actually signing for the parent club, or is he going to club number 2, club number 3? And they have to remain independent of each other. But more and more, we are seeing clubs pitch themselves as that multi-club. So maybe you're not ready to sign for our first team, but we will, at different stage of your career, we'll have you covered. And if it doesn't work out, you can go to our MLS team. And they almost try and pitch it as, whether it goes well, whether it goes bad, we've got you covered within our own group. From our side, we look at it and go, well, hang on, that player's career should be navigated by the player's best interests, and not just going from one feeder team to the slightly higher feeder team, and then eventually you get to the first team. You know, who's to say that's the correct career path for that young talent?
It's an interesting one. You know, I think these, if you like, a loophole, very legal loophole, by the way, in the world of football at this point in time. But you know what I mean? A way of doing something constructive with your talent in the world of football, which is perfectly fine. But obviously not every club has the finances to do, could give you a sporting advantage. So why not do it ultimately? But is it always in the best interest of the player? I probably agree with you in what you had to just say there, Marlon. Kieran, I wanted to ask you about Manchester City. We did another episode, a very informative episode, where we talk about loads of the intricacies of PSR and APT and all of that stuff. But I do want to ask you, in your area of expertise, how big the case against Manchester City is for English football and for spending in particular in the future. You all know, of course, 115 charges from the Premier League against Manchester City. Manchester City deny any wrongdoing, but they are particular financial breaches, which we don't have to go to. They're all allegations, of course. We don't have to go into them specifically. But I wonder, in terms of the case as a whole, what either result might mean for spending in the future.
I don't think it will actually impact upon the spending of other clubs, apart from the fact that if Manchester City in particular successfully defend their position, there's going to be a huge legal bill. Yeah, we're talking potentially in excess of £100 million. And that's going to have to be borne by all of the other clubs in the Premier League. So that could be a financial hit, and that would have an impact upon budgets, presumably for season 25-26. Should the Premier League be successful in terms of its charges, the implications for Manchester City will be seismic, because given that the commissions for both Nottingham Forest and Everton said that these were minor breaches of the rules over a very small period of time, the allegations against City are covering a period of 9 years. The allegations are broadly that of misrepresentation, I think is the politest way I can describe it, should they be upheld, which would mean that I think it would be impossible for the board of Manchester City to remain in position. So that would be very, very significant. You know, how would the owner react to such a situation? That will have repercussions for the club involved. If Manchester City are successful, then where does this leave the Premier League itself? Because Manchester City do feel that they are being picked upon. They use this phrase, the tyranny of the majority, that they are being targeted for being successful. Yeah, would these charges be taking place, for example, if Manchester City had finished 8th on average for the last decade? I suspect this conversation wouldn't be taking place. It's because they've won trophies, it's because they got into the Champions League that we've had a result of all this. The financial repercussions could be huge for City, because other clubs could then say, or they will certainly be talking to their lawyers and saying, if Manchester City had been charged earlier, we would have qualified for Europe, we would have received a title, we would have received bonuses from our sponsors, and therefore there could be some further legal issues against the club itself, which if the owner doesn't continue to back Manchester City would put its financial existence very much in place.
That's exactly something I was going to say. I had a similar situation at Derby when Wickham and I can't remember the other club, Middlesbrough, made claims against us based on the sporting positions that we finished compared to them and stuff like that. Now, when you speak about City, if they were to potentially get a points deduction, let's talk about that first. So if we're talking about if all of the charges were upheld and they were charging all of those, we're talking about almost relegation to National League probably by the time they get all those points. Now, financially, are you then saying you're going to pull the carpet from under their feet and they can only spend what is spent in League Two or wherever it is, and then you're wiping out the club? So I don't think the Premier League are ever going to do that because they'll cause a problem themselves in wiping out a club. I think the other side, in terms of when you talk about people trying to sue them, I think that would be the issue. But it's at what point do you stop? Because it's like, oh, well, actually, we would have finished above them, we would have finished above them. And then I think it's just going to be a can of worms that if City don't get away with it, I think it's going to change the scope for forever.
A reminder, City deny all wrongdoing, and we shall find out towards the end of the season what the outcome of that independent investigation is. I still think it's very intriguing and informative in terms of where we're heading, though, because if it's proven that City have done absolutely nothing wrong, then other clubs will say, actually, there is a little bit more we can do with our associated party transactions. Essentially, the idea that you might sponsor oneself, not exactly, but companies related to the ownership group being able to put money into the club. Where do you sit on that, Kieran, in terms of it being a force of good in the game, if you know what I mean? I don't know if you would necessarily describe it as that, but many would argue there's nothing wrong with it.
Well, we see it all over football. You can go to clubs like Accrington Stanley, and their stadium is named after the owner's own company. So that is something which has existed in football for many, many a year. I think what we have to be careful is the level of money involved, and the rules that we have at present, do prevent somebody from Abu Dhabi from sponsoring the corner flags for £100 million a year. So there are a system of checks and balances. There's also, remember, we keep talking about the Premier League's beef with Manchester City. There are rules in existence from UEFA as well, which would restrict a club from spending unlimited amounts. It's a case of perhaps turning down the dial a little bit and trying to reach a position whereby, whether you like or not, if we go back to the position before Roman Abramovich, there were two clubs competing for the Premier League title every year. It was Manchester United in the main or Arsenal. And it was starting to get a bit boring. So Roman Abramovich came through, and now we had three clubs who were potentially challenging. Manchester City came along, and it was four. You've got to give Liverpool's owners, FSG, huge credit for effectively organically changing Liverpool into the powerhouse that they are today. But Liverpool always had that history and heritage, and the size of Anfield, and the COP support, which could potentially give Liverpool the ability to be competitive once more. So I think we've got, on the back of what we've seen at both City and Chelsea, and potentially at Newcastle, we've got a more competitive league than we see in most European countries, and that's actually helped to grow the game because it's increased jeopardy. And the one thing that you want as either a fan who's attending a match or the broadcast viewer, the person that's sitting down on a Sunday afternoon to watch the match on Sky, or watching matches in the Champions League for TNT, or wherever the broadcaster's going to be, they want to know that they're not going to watch a procession. And that's what we've got at present, due to more clubs coming in and being more competitive. You don't want to throw that away. The new money which has come in from these owners has enhanced the game because it's become more competitive. That's not good if you're one of those clubs who are historically always going to win the competition.
Let's talk a little bit about sponsors then before we move finally to television and broadcast deals. Sponsors are clearly important, whether they're ones related to the club or not. They do put extra pressure on individual players, though, particularly the bigger names at each football club, to essentially fulfill all of the sponsors' requests in terms of promoting their product alongside the big names and faces at a particular football club. So what is that like for you on a week-to-week basis?
I think there's been a huge increase in the amount of club sponsors on the shirt sleeve, on the back of the shirt, kit sponsors, technical sponsors, drink sponsors, betting sponsors. But all of those sponsorship contracts will give some element of access to the players for commercial, marketing and advertising purposes. That then equates to, after training, most weeks, there is a rush of the media teams and the commercial teams at each club trying to get the players to do commercial activity. And you can imagine the players' views on this. They don't want all of these distractions. There are limits in the Premier League contract that they have to fulfil certain obligations. But where those obligations are stretched and they are asked to do more and more, there has been a big pushback from the players to say, look, we don't want to keep on having to do all of these commercial appointments all the time. We will do some, but if I've said yes to this, don't come to me now for another 4 weeks until the next one. But the problem sometimes is that you have certain sponsors that only want certain key players.
That's interesting because now with the modern way of doing the agency stuff, even though a player has to fulfill certain obligations for the club, if you are the man that's literally doing 90% of the adverts for your football club, is there scope to put something in the contract where a player can either be compensated individually for those?
Yeah, you can do an extended personal agreement. So usually you have to feature with, it's a 3-player rule, so usually you have to feature with 3 other players to stop it being deemed as almost an individual endorsement. If that sponsor only wants you in your club kit and no one else, that's an individual sponsorship agreement. And that's where a player can be paid more as an individual, which doesn't form part of his Premier League contract obligations.
But won't they get all 3 of the same players every time?
Yeah, and I'm sure some sponsors would want that, yeah. Listen, it's an intriguing one in terms of money coming into the game. Extra routes for sponsorship is one thing. You mentioned it a little bit earlier on as well. An increase in TV rights deals, Kieran. But also now an announcement that the Premier League is going to end its partnership in 2026 with IMG, who are producing basically its in-house content, Premier League productions. If you're outside of the United Kingdom, a massively watched TV station with all the live Premier League games programming around that as well. And there is kind of an implication from what we know so far that we may be moving towards what many fans have wanted for a long time, which is the Premier League streamed. Maybe I guess a deal where you might choose individual matches. You might get a subscription to just watch your team's games home and away online. It obviously means that all of the global money could come directly into the Premier League as well. And they, who knows, may end their global rights deals as well. What do you think this all means?
I think the Premier League has taken its time to make this decision. It's been learning the ropes to a certain extent by monitoring how IMG and others have been fantastic partners for the Premier League, and that should never be forgotten. The quality of the broadcast product is fantastic, and you don't want to throw that away because it would be quite disruptive. But there's certainly plenty of external broadcast partners who you could use to get involved with in terms of a future relationship. What you have with the present deals is that you have certainty, and when we got certainty until 2029, that's when the domestic deal, as we know it, will finish, but it's likely to be up for renewal. I suspect what we will see is perhaps that the Premier League will take some of the matches which are currently not part of the deal. So currently we've got 280 matches out of the 300 which are being broadcast live. Why not take a couple more, just sort of 20 or 40 game packages, and bring those in-house? Again, the Premier League can learn the ropes. It can see what works and what doesn't work in terms of tech, in terms of punditry, in terms of the additional features. And then if that's successful, I suspect the deal after that, which will perhaps be at 2032, 2033, could be sort of the nuclear button. But Sky will want that to not be the case, because the whole of Sky's business model is built upon people renewing their subscriptions for Sky Sports. The Premier League is by far the biggest driver of interest in terms of Sky's success.
So what happens now moving forward with football finances? Just a final word on how much it's growing and where we're going with it. I am, as you can probably tell, quite risk averse when it comes to the money going out of football. I'd like to see it, stick with the players. I don't mind them earning more money. They're what we watch on a weekly basis. I'm not too keen on owners taking huge money out of the game in dividends, but that's just me. Call me a traditionalist. What would you like to see with football finances, particularly in England moving forward?
I think if you look at the number of clubs that have actually gone out of existence, it's incredibly low. We lost Bury, and that was down to a rogue owner. We lost Macclesfield Town, that was down to a rogue owner. It wasn't down to the broader issues of finances in football. So I wouldn't tinker too much. I think what I'd like to see most of all is perhaps a smoother transition from Premier League to Championship and vice versa. That will take some of the risk away. And if there's less risk in going up or trying to avoid going down, if there's less risk, then there's less incentive to overspend. And then the finances effectively sort themselves out, and the level of losses that we are seeing, if you are in the Championship, losing £400,000 a week is the norm, and you've got some clubs who have been in that division for 10, 12 years or more, where the owners are quite happy for that to be the case. I think those losses can be tapered down. Football's an incredibly robust industry, and I suspect that will be the case because there's such a level of interest in the game from an investment point of view that even if a club is struggling financially, you will always find somebody else willing to come in and perhaps take it in a different angle. And that can be transformative. You've only got to look to see what's happened to Ipswich Town under their new US-based ownership, and also Birmingham City this season. Birmingham have become sort of the very much the poster boys for what can happen when owners come in, make promises, and then start to deliver in those promises, which even exceed the wildest expectations of fans themselves.
Final word, Marlon. You were nodding in agreement.
I think we can add Wrexham to that list as well. And I think the US influence doesn't just extend to football clubs. I think they see value in the whole wider spectrum of football and sports. I mean, even in our field on the representation side, I looked at a stat the other day, and I think 5 or 6 of the top 10 agencies in the world are now owned by American parent companies. So I think they can see that the value or the peak of this whole sports network or global sports product hasn't reached the top yet.
I don't see any end to it, I have to say. Final word on it. It's fantastic to cover football because you know that you're in a sector which is investing. Let's call it that. Constantly investing, probably beyond its means. But we get a brilliant product at the end of it. At least we can all agree on that, at least. Kieran Maguire, it's been a real pleasure to have you on Decision Makers. That's just about our time for now. Gentlemen, thank you very much as well. Informative as always. Listen, hopefully that has got into the depths of football finance, which, by the way, we could have spoken about for about 3 or 4 hours here. But we touched on a number of topics, so hopefully you got a little bit more education on that and you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave us a little bit of a rating. You can follow us on your podcast app as well. Hit the notification button. You will not miss a single episode. And make sure you follow us on social media. You'll find the details in the description too. And we will see you soon on another episode of Decision Makers, lifting the lid on the secret world of sport. We'll see you soon. Take care.